Let's start this lecture with a little reading here. It's a little story. I'll read it for you and you can follow on the PowerPoint. First, I'll read this and then there's a question at the end. A man and his young son were in an automobile accident. The father was killed and the son, who was critically injured, was rushed to a hospital. As attendants wheeled the unconscious boy into the emergency room, the doctor on duty looked down at him and said, "My God, it's my son." The question is, what was the relationship of the doctor to the injured boy? And you can ponder that. And ponder also what your process of pondering initially was. I have another, I'm not going to give the answer now. We can come back to this next time. Here's another little riddle. The blind beggar had a brother. The blind beggar's brother died. The brother who died had no brother. What relation was the blind beggar to the blind beggar's brother? These both come from an article from long ago. You can probably see some of the language that it's not really current. By Miller and Swift, One Small Step for Genkind in New York Times. So that's the source for this. And our topic today, as you could probably guess, based on these two stories, is language, gender, and sexuality. This is chapter 12 in our textbook, Wardhaugh and Fuller. It's a relatively short chapter. We have divided it for 2 days, so we'll cover the first part today. Some of these questions may already lead you to the second part of the story. So some terminology and some questions here first to start. So a review terms and concepts, compare and contrast these pairs. Gender and sex category, what's similar, what's different. Gender and sexuality. Wardhaugh and Fuller address these terms in the very beginning of that chapter. They also talk about sexism and heteronormativity. What is similar, what is different there. Gender exclusive language, which means basically that we are talking about very clearly about women being associated with certain words and men with certain others. Gender preferential language, check out those terms and concepts. Then next time we'll talk more about dominance approach and difference approach. Ideologies and identities. We have talked quite a bit about ideologies and identities. This doesn't have to do with only gender and our sex categories. Those are part of our identities, and yet they are not the only ones, because it's also, the social class, our ethnicity, where we live, and so on. So it's a complex identity. Is not only gender and sex category. Some review questions to ponder about for the discussion while you're reading this. What are some examples of sexism in language? You may have encountered those during your lives. I certainly feel that I have encountered some sexism in language or noticed some sexism in language. What are some examples of sexist and heteronormative discourses? Discourses with a big D, according to Paul G.E.E., who launched this idea of writing discourse with a capital D when it refers to these ideological things. What are some of the ways that men and women have been said to speak differently? We have already talked quite a bit about that when we were reviewing the work done in the 1970s. That was not Labov's main concern, but it was Peter Trudgill's, one of his foci, that he was looking at how women and men, working class, middle class, approach language, see language a little bit differently. Language is a tool for us to send a message about who we are, what we want to identify with, and we talked about that already quite a bit. So what are some of the ways that men and women have been, I read that already, sorry. So what's the evidence for these differences, and can they be generalized to all men and women? There are interesting pieces of research studies that Wardhaugh and Fuller summarize in their text. For instance, there are languages that have a certain way of speaking reserved for men and another for women, and sometimes there can be this crossover. Japanese is said to be, or is, a language which marks a woman as a speaker just by the pronoun. If I'm talking about myself in Japanese, which I don't know, but I wish, so the Japanese woman would use the term watashi of I when she's talking about herself, and a Japanese man would say I as boku. So depending on whether you, and excuse my pronunciation, so boku versus watashi, and those are reserved for men and for women, separate pronouns. So in the same way as in English we use he for men as third person singular pronoun, she for women as a third person singular pronoun, but in Japanese there are pronouns, first person singular pronouns, the English I, that is a different pronoun for men and women when they are the speakers. So it's interesting. Languages do things differently. There is also a particle that women use at the end of an utterance, and that would be wa and wa, and that marks them as a speaker who is a female. Men wouldn't add that wa at the end of the sentence. Now we can talk about different things, even though English doesn't have such a concrete way of marking whether I am a woman speaker or a male speaker. We still tend to somehow, in our way of speaking, send messages that I'm a female, I'm a male, not this concretely as in Japanese. But women are said to use more hedges, the hesitations, and more than men on an average. But this is not an either-or thing, of course. It's kind of like proposed as a somewhat generalizable tendency. Now, I used the hedge when I said somewhat generalizable. Somewhat is something we don't want to make too firm assertions, and as women we often use these types of hedging phrases or words like that's quite interesting, and I am not sure, but I want to say that it's this, and so on and so forth. So we use those kinds of hedges that are not clear either or indicators of whether we are men or women, but there seems to be this tendency that women tend to hedge a little bit more in conversations. In other words, they may sound a little bit less confident. Now, these things change as society changes. Of course, women sound less confident if they are not in a position that is a power position, but women today are found in these positions, and women are speaking with less hedging language when they are in those positions. So those are very interesting topics. They are hard to do research on because when we just have a hunch that this may or may not be a generalization, this may or may not be changing, so we would need to have huge numbers of data, and we would need to have just collect naturally occurring conversation. Of course, you could look at some canned conversation that is like TV sitcoms or something like that, which is supposedly reflecting naturally occurring conversation, but of course it's very planned because there's a script for it first, so it's not, in that sense, it's not really naturally occurring because it's scripted. But anyway, it's supposed to be a reflection. But getting real naturally occurring conversation data is tough, as you probably have noticed when you are planning your half-hour recordings of naturally occurring conversation. You have to take a lot of things into consideration. Who do you want to ask to contribute, and how to go about it, and how to make sure that there are not too many people, but that there are enough participants. How do I make sure that this recording is of high quality? And these are research questions, practical questions for all researchers, that you need to take these into consideration. So, but I do want to go back to the fact that even if language may mark very clearly a female speaker and a male speaker, like for instance in Japanese by the pronoun system or by the particles at the utterance's end. Japanese is said to be changing, so that young women are nowadays starting to use that boku, first-person singular pronoun, which was reserved for males in the past. So there is some research about that there may be a change going on there, that the pronoun system may be changing. Why would women do that? Why do they want to indicate that they are, by the use of pronouns, that I'm not a woman? Because every time I talk about myself, I have to remind myself and the speaker and the participants of that speech event that I am not a man, I am a woman. Same way for men, but why would women then choose to use the male first-person singular pronoun? You can ponder about that, but of course we have noticed already in Peter Trudgill's work in the 1970s in England, that women were older women, middle-aged women. They were aspiring to the next social class category speech in their own speech, or at least they were hoping they're doing it. They were not necessarily doing it, but they were kind of like over-reporting that they are using the more standard forms. Whereas already Trudgill found that some working class women, young women, were using more masculine speak, and I'm using masculine speak as not like, it's just as a way of convenience too. They were using this working class dialect, male working class dialect. And why are we doing it? because we want to assert ourselves. We don't want to be always hedging and this, female kind of weak sounding speaker. We want to be strong, and language is one way of making us strong. And this particular chapter is in a sense quite fascinating because it focuses on gender and sex and language, and it pulls out these examples of how we speak differently because we want to send a certain kind of a message, and that is done with language. Like I've said several times already in this class, that we send messages about who we are, our affiliations, group affiliations, by the way we dress and by the way we speak. Those are two main things available for us to indicate who we want to affiliate with. And it's kind of really fascinating. We don't tend to, we choose our clothes sometimes very carefully. And if we don't, that also sends a message. If we always, wear the same outfit, that's like, I don't care. This is not important for me. This is the kind of a person I am. But we don't typically pay a lot of attention to how we speak, because it just kind of comes naturally. We have talked a lot about the fact that the speech situation gives us the frame within which our language can vary, and we are very subconsciously cognizant about the features of the speech situation. So Wardhaugh and Fuller also cite a lot of other studies among Australian Aboriginal people where there are differences in what kind of language a man uses versus a woman. But we don't need to go all the way to Australia in order to find a language that makes these kinds of differences. There is our very own Texas language or languages, Alabama and Kwasati or Coshada, that are spoken at the Alabama Coshada Reservation, just about 60 miles from us here, east from Huntsville. And on the reservation, these two languages are spoken, and Kwasati is said to be making a little bit of a difference in how men use language and how women use language. A formal difference, not like what I used of English, like hedging, more typical of women perhaps. Perhaps is a hedge, which I'm using because I don't want to make a very blatant generalization, but these would be formal ways of showing that, the speaker is a male. And just a similar kind of a thing, that when we speak about a third person, singular person, we need to make the choice between he and she, and nowadays also they, if people identify as between the binary categories. So there are these formal grammatical ways of marking gender, and then more not really grammatical but language choice and more discourse related. Okay, so there are languages that mark these things formally, and it doesn't mean that these languages don't change. And then one of the big things we come back here in this chapter is the Whorfian hypothesis. Can we, by changing language, change the world? So some key points here, some questions, some key points. Do women and men speak differently? If they do, how? I do want to add another point here, another example in addition to the hedges. If somebody uses words like cute, adorable, that speaker is likely to be a man or a woman. So ponder about that, and that kind of allows you. And then of course we would say that women are more likely to use words like adorable, cute, oh, and so on when you see a baby picture or a little kitten picture. Oh, but of course, man can use these adjectives and the interjection also to send a message that I'm a sensitive person, I'm a sensitive man, and whatever identity a person wants to, whatever message about his or her identity a person wants to send. So do women and men speak differently? I would say that there are certain ways that are different in speaking. If they do, how? So listen to the language around you and make mental notes, and you will see that something that is said may be more female, maybe more male, and then the fact that we have this sense that something may be more female and something may be more male, this fact can be used to shift the identity of a person more towards the other category. Okay, one thing that is really important to note is that languages are not sexist. It's people who use the languages that may be sexist, maybe racist. Languages themselves are kind of innocent. I mean, this is obvious in a way. I do want to take a comparative example between English and my first language, which is Finnish. English makes the third person singular gender difference. There is no gender neutral pronoun in English. English uses he and she. So basically every time you talk about a third person singular, you have to make this choice. Are you talking about a man or a woman? And that pronoun sends the message to the hearer that you're talking about a man or a woman. So we constantly keep reminded of the person's gender or sex when we talk about a third person singular. My first language, Finnish, does not make this distinction. There is one pronoun which is used, and I've mentioned this before because it's an intriguing difference. The pronoun is hän, and that's used both for men and women. Now, so the pronoun hän does not inform the hearer about whether you're talking about a man or a woman. Now, is Finnish a more gender-neutral language? It has this gender-neutral pronoun, but it doesn't mean that Finnish is more or less sexist than English is, because it's the speakers of language who are sexist or racist or whatever. So this is not the language's fault in a way. It's sometimes I've been asked in Finnish, because people who are English speakers, they find it so natural that we get the hint, the information about who the other person is talking about, that person's sex or gender, by the pronoun choice, he or she. And I've been asked, so how do you know whether a person is talking about a man or a woman? And the answer is you don't. But at some point, if it's important, a person may ask, oh, was it a man or was it a woman? So I have been asked this question. I had seen a doctor and I was talking about hand, the doctor did this and the doctor did that. And at some point a person asked, was it a female doctor or a male doctor? And then I just, informed the person, oh, it was a male doctor. I don't know why it's important, but for some reason it seems to be important whether the doctor is a male or a female. I guess it's such a personal thing to do, to go and see a doctor and talk to them about your health issues, that it may be a factor, as everything is a factor in a speech situation. So anyway, but I'm not saying that because Finnish does not have a non-gender neutral pronoun, it has a gender neutral third person singular pronoun. It's not less sexist. Languages are innocent things and they are put to use by people. Okay, so when societies change, languages often reflect this change, and we'll look at some very concrete examples of how language has changed, how we change words in order to reflect the changes in society. Because when society changes, then the language doesn't, the words don't. This is very often, this is about words. It can be about phrases as well. So language keeps changing to kind of like try to match the changes in society. We can flip this around and ask, can we affect societal change by changing language? Can we make the society a better society, a more compassionate society, a more equal society by changing words? Now we are back into the Wordthian hypothesis. If we believe we can do this, then we believe in what Wirth said, that our language is the constraint for us to see the world. Therefore, changing the language might allow us to see the world differently, and that might affect a societal change. It's basically, we talked about this in the beginning of the class. Does language affect society? Does society affect language? And we kind of decided, had a consensus about that it goes both ways. And so maybe there is something to the Wordthian hypothesis. Maybe we can at least pretend that we have a more equal world, a more compassionate world, a less racist world, if we stick to certain phrases and certain terms. However, language is not omnipotent. If we change language, but people's attitudes don't change, if women continue to be paid less for the same job, it doesn't matter if that occupation is called with the shared name for men who are in that occupation and women as well. So there need to be other societal changes that reflect that we are working towards a more equal society, more compassionate society, less sexist, less racist, less cruel society. So let's see if I can get this going.
Pam is the one Greg wants to marry.
Just relax, honey. What's wrong with you?
But before he can pop the question, he'll have to meet
Hi, Daddy!
the parents.
What are you driving there, Ford?
Oh, yeah.
It's an interesting color. You picked it? Oh, no, the first guy picked it. Why?
Oh, they say geniuses pick green. But you didn't pick it.
Be nice to this one, okay?
Okay, I'll try.
Now he will enter their home.
You know, Greg's in medicine too, Larry.
Oh, really? What field? Nursing.
Not a lot of men in your profession, are there, Greg?
And earn his way.
You want to hear a story? I milked a cow once.
Okay, Greg, Ben Stiller's character in Meet the Parents he's a male nurse, and you see how these family members are laughing when it comes out that he is a male nurse. So we talk about female doctors and male nurses, and of course this movie is dated already. It's not a fresh movie, so it was really kind of a pointed little episode within that movie when it comes out that the protagonist in this movie is in the field of medicine, and then these other family members who are doctors, these other guys, they start laughing when he says he's a nurse, he's in nursing. And then if that clip had continued, they would, a male nurse. So it is kind of like, you're breaking the expectations. Society had changed, that there are many more male nurses now. At that point, it was a new thing, so it was kind of like, an interesting point that the movie made. Of course, the movie was very preferred the male nurse character, Greg, the main character, who we sympathized with against all these jerks. So female doctors, male nurses, I have an anecdote from my own life. Not that long ago, I was sitting in my office here in our building with another colleague who was a woman. And so there's two women sitting, somebody comes into the office. This is not a colleague, this is somebody from the outside, maybe a book buyer or something. And so he comes to my office and he says, are you ladies interested in this? And my colleague says, we're actually professors. So he was addressing us as ladies. And he didn't mean anything bad, but he just wasn't expecting us to be professors. And he says, so you are lady professors. So female doctors, lady professors, and male nurses. Of course, these are, in a way, sexist ways of referring to occupations, because they presuppose that doctors are typically males, nurses are typically female, professors are typically male, but the world has changed. So, anyway, here's just this is from the Diversity and Inclusion Gender Neutral Job Titles website, a blog, and I just collected these here so that we would be thinking about these things, and most of these changes have already materialized, so that you may not even have heard about an anchorman or assemblyman, because they are called anchors and assembly persons. Businessmen, preferably business persons, because women are in business too. Cameraman, camera operator, even though somebody in this blog pointed out that camera operator is a very specific kind of occupational title in the film industry, and it's not identical to just, someone who is called a cameraman. So there is a difference here, denotational difference. But anyway, these are the suggestions chairman, I don't know if anyone ever uses the word chairman anymore. It's chair or chairperson. Clergyman. Of course, most priests and pastors and ministers and so on, they have historically been men. But when women could enter this position, and it was a theological debate whether they can or whether they can't, so we can't really talk about clergymen anymore because there are clergy women, and that would sound kind of, strange. So replace these by minister or pastor. Congressman, member of Congress, because there are women in the Congress as well. Construction man, construction worker, to include also women. Councilmen have become council members. Craftsmen have become artisans, which covers both men and women. Crewman, crew member. Doorman, an occupation in big cities where you have these high-rise residential buildings. Doorkeeper and door attendant would be gender neutral. Firemen have become firefighters. Foreman, supervisor, or boss. I have to tell you an anecdote of the word boss. I was in a departmental leadership position for a few years back, and I had colleagues that I was their supervisor now. Male colleagues, older colleagues, people I had known since I came here to this university, and while everyone was really nice about my now all of a sudden being in this supervisory position toward them, they some of them wanted to call me boss, like, "Hi boss, how are you boss?" And it was a friendly, of course, way of referring to me, but it was, interestingly, it came from these very, very macho colleagues who I felt had some kind of an underlying problem with my being in a position to evaluate them and be in that supervisory position. So they called me boss to kind of like rub it in my face that I'm the boss now, and it was a little bit exaggerated way of referring to me, but not everybody. There were just a couple of people who may have had a problem with that, and then it came out with this kind of like flattery, which was not necessarily sincere. I don't know, but that's how I perceived that boss. I told one very macho person, "Please don't call me boss. Call me with my first name." So and then of course people are like, what was the problem with boss? Boss is also, it's not like, it's a little bit informal. That wasn't the problem, but anyway, interesting, tiny, very subtle things that we can message in the selection. So garbage men have become trash collectors and sanitation workers. Now here we see when if you call someone a sanitation worker, it sounds really fancy. It's euphemizing because we are literally talking about garbage and trash. So it's a little bit euphemizing at the same time as it is more gender neutral than garbage man. Okay, so it tries to kind of glorify this occupation. Handyman, maintenance person, or fixer. Fixer is like boss, informal. Male men have become postal workers or mail carriers. Maintenance men have become janitors or custodians or caretakers, because women can do these jobs as well. patrolmen, policemen, police officers. I don't know if the word policeman is used at all. This would be really interesting little tiny research projects. If you haven't chosen your research project yet, you could see about how these terms have made it or have not made it. Pizza person, not pizza man. Salesperson, not salesman. And whether men are gender neutrally meteorologists. So these kinds of changes reflect our changing society, and people pick them up. It typically takes maybe a generation or so, and people start using these quote-unquote new terms. So this is so-called associative engineering, that we are wanting to engineer the attitudes of people and the associations of people, that if we don't call an artisan a craftsman, then we include the women who can be there. So when these kinds of changes happen consciously and formally, that there is a list somewhere like diversity and inclusion, gender neutral job titles, which you can find, then we are doing what is called language planning, that we are consciously and formally trying to change the language. We have already talked about another area where there are these conscious efforts of trying to change the world by change people's attitudes by changing the language. The so-called people-first language in English is an attempt to do that. So you don't say a blind beggar like in that little anecdote I showed in the beginning of the class. You would say a beggar with bad eyesight, or a beggar who is blind. So that would be the people first language, that you have a post modifier for beggar. Maybe there should be a nicer way of saying beggar as well. So, because this is, once we start doing this work of trying to change language, then we will start noticing a lot of other areas where, like lexicon needs to change. The people first language is a suggestion of a grammatical structural change, that we don't use pre-modification like blind beggar. We would use post-modification, a beggar who is blind. I have written about this, and I'm not sure how well this people first language actually linguistically works, because when you say a beggar who is blind, the word blind is then in the focus of the sentence, at the end of the sentence position, and I don't think that it hides the blindness any better than having a pre-modification blind beggar. But that's the suggestion, and it hasn't been adopted very well. For instance, by the newspapers, they still use pre-modification quite often. But another interesting thing that you could look at. Grammatical versus biological gender in language. I want to point out this aspect of gender, that gender in language is sometimes used to classify nouns. Gender is used. It really is not gender that is used there. German, for instance, has masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns. Der, die, and das are the articles, the determiners that go with masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns in German. And Old English, because it's related closely to German, it had also masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns. Now this has nothing to do with gender, biological gender. It was just the grammarian's way of classifying the behavior of different classes of nouns. So we have these nouns that they called masculine, that behave, that take certain kinds of inflectional endings, for instance, and they have to agree with agreement with adjectives and determiners and so on. Then another class of nouns that were artificially called feminine, and they behaved inflectionally in a certain other way. And then neuter nouns that behaved in a third kind of a way. So nothing to do with biological gender. Masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns in German and in Old English and other languages who use this system, they could just as well be called A nouns, B nouns, and C nouns, or whatever categorization you want to use, apple nouns and orange nouns and banana nouns, but the grammarians chose masculine, feminine, and neuter. And then people kind of like tend to think that it has something to do with gender. It doesn't, with biological gender, but it doesn't. So Old English had this system of 3 different kinds of classes of nouns that behaved in a certain way, and they were called masculine, feminine, and neuter. And that meant that, for instance, the word for girl or the word for woman, it could be, there were 3 synonyms. You could refer to it as with a masculine noun, with a weefman, woman, masculine, weef, and kläftige, that were so synonymous nouns referring to a woman, and one's masculine, one's neuter, one's feminine, one's masculine, one's feminine, one's neuter, and then you choose, if you say here's a woman, and then you choose the pronoun to refer to that noun antecedent according to the grammatical gender of the noun. So you could use the pronoun he for woman if you had used the Old English word weefman for a woman. So here's a weefman, he is nice. So that was the early Old English system, but pretty soon the biological gender took over, that you started using she even for antecedents that were grammatically masculine, and that's what we have today. So that's all for today's lecture, and keep reading chapter 12 later.